the failed swordsman of Sylvania, the second joint combat training. In that scene, the protagonist Taylor would crush all the strongest freshmen. Then, finally, he would take down Claude of the Faculty of Alchemy, who drank the evil god's blood and exited the exam room, only to hear news of Adele's death. At the time, how Adele died was not well known, and the innocent and childlike Claris completely lost trust in the Order, becoming an entirely different person. The players of the game considered Claris's sudden change a complete destruction of her character and named her the Faithless Saintess. In order to contain the Faithless Saintess that now opposed them, the Order then dispatched troops to Arkan Island. In the end, the one that went berserk and single-handedly destroyed the Order's forces was the Act 3's final boss, an awakened Lucy. That was how Act 3 was originally meant to go. However, now a giant-scaled creature stretched forth its wings and roared. Thunder clapped, lightning slashed through the atmosphere, and a chill overtook the school as the sacred lance dragon arose. The creature was massive, and massive was an understatement as it dwarfed the entire school. The dragon was called Wellbrock. The creature was the boss of Act 5, and he was supposed to appear at the end of the main story of the failed swordsman of Sylvania. Ed was horrified to see him now, and the tides had shifted way more than they should. That great beast was a walking hazard and was way too big to even exist inside the school without causing damage. Even the very waters surrounding the school shifted each time that the beast lifted its foot. Students and structures went flying each time the monster so much as breathed in the wrong direction, and many of them shouted with pain. The creature was not using magic, it was no more than an insignificant movement, but they could barely stand even that. By taking just one step forward, students were sent running as everything around them broke to pieces and they hurried to not get caught in the catastrophe of the monster's wake. Ed groaned as students screamed around him, falling to his hands and knees as he tried to steady himself. Half of the dormitory was already reduced to ashes just by the creature lifting its foot from the after and bringing it to the shore. The building crumbled around them, and students panicked. The main character had only managed to survive the initial fall because he was in the faculty building. Many students raced through the school, but Ed ran ahead, his survival based on nothing more than luck. The boy leapt right out of an open window, using his arms to shield himself. He may not be able to use magic for several years. He might even end up never being able to use magic ever again. However, if that was the case, even if it meant putting his life on the line, the boy was not going to stop. He unleashed the maximum output of his power, firing directly at the beast, doing everything in his power to protect the school. Nerylda, the forest wolf spirit, was summoned, and she launched right at the giant. The boy knew that he would die either way in a battle against such a giant beast, so in that case, he would not stand by and do nothing. Meanwhile, in Trix Hall, someone yelled for the Saintess to run. She knew that she had to get away, and she asked for the servants to quickly gather the others. The knights fought hard and told the Saintess to take their hands. They would escort her to the carriage that they had prepared. However, before the knight could finish his sentence, the beast took one step forward, its toenails piercing the knight and turning his body into a shish kebab right in front of the formerly sheltered girl. Sylvania should revoke its title as the safest school cause that gory sight surpassed anything that the Saintess had seen before. A holy bubble of spiritual magic surrounded her, and she squealed, falling back as the beast stepped forward, eliminating the knights who wanted to save her. There was dust everywhere, and the girl cried in terror and horror. She had no idea what was going on, and it had to be the worst day of her life. She saw scales embedded in the bodies of the knights and realized that they had been killed by the creature's mere act of shaking off its giant scales. Still, the other knights pulled the girl forward, telling her that they needed to leave immediately. Claris followed as he directed, but was at a loss, wondering what wicked person had created such a horrific thing. The knight yelled for Marv to prepare the carriage, ignoring the fact that he was covered with blood. The man in question stumbled as he came forward, rubbing at his bleeding shoulder as he explained that the carriage had already been destroyed. Instead, he asked the girl to take the well-trained horse and to flee. The horse would surely take her across the Mexus Bridge and outside Arkan Island. The man's blood-covered hands gave her the reins, and the poor girl cried that she had never learned how to ride a horse. Still, the men insisted, telling her to grab the reins and to hold on tightly to the horse's neck. Even though they were both heavily injured, for the sake of their duty, they fought to get her to safety. The girl was put on the horse, and with one smack, the horse went riding off with the instruction to take the Saintess outside the castle. The girl squealed as she held onto the horse for dear life, crying as she glanced back at those who risked their lives to save her. Claris had always thought that it was an exaggerated tale, like something one would hear from the myths. She could not believe that such a terrifying creature was real. Now, looking at all the fallen corpses around her, the girl recalled the story that the Archbishop would read to her back then. The story of Wellbrook, the sacred lance dragon that now caused so much carnage as the princess rode to safety. Every time the dragon would spew out his magic-laden breath, which resembled that of the sun, everything beneath him would cease to exist. Above her, the dragon charged up its lightning that sparkled with the dangerous blue lightning flame, electrifying and lighting up everything it touched, and then releasing it to the people who suffered below. The Saintess cried out as the lightning fell, but someone suddenly activated the large-scale magic nullification barrier. This intense magic barrier collided with the dragon's electric fire. The Saintess stares up at the beautiful barrier in amazement, shocked to find herself unharmed. The barrier had been cast over the school, and the girl could look up now at the one who cast it with awe. That was the great Principal Offles, finally defending his school, and the man cursed that even high-rank magic could only deflect its breath. Even the principal recognized that the sacred lance dragon had awoken much too early, but the dragon did not seem to care about its sleep schedule and it lashed out anyway, its large claw fighting against the barrier that Obel had set up. The man growled, saying that the beast was not even going to give him the time to imprison it. It seemed the dragon knew it was about to get sent back to jail, and it wanted no part in that. The chains of providence were then activated using the highest ranked telekinesis magic. These purple chains wrapped around the giant blue lizard. One day, just once, when this school was faced with a great threat, Lucy wanted the chance to lend them her strength. The young girl breathed in relief that she had come in time to lend her chains in aid, though this was not what she'd had in mind when it came to helping the school. The most powerful mage in the school was finally on the scene, and she was finally battling against something at her level. Now she could put her skills to good use. The dragon, of course, was not at all pleased to see the school's hero, and he made his protest known with a very loud roar. The chains began to fracture and shock. Something that had never happened before was beginning to occur. Lucy's magic for the first time had been defeated by the power of another. The chains fell apart, much to the shock of the young girl who stared in shock at her defeat. The blast of purple power was met by the beast's giant claw, and the genius mage went skyrocketing as the creature successfully broke some part of the barrier. Debris came down as magic collided, and even the poor saintess was thrown right from her horse. The poor thing squealed as she flew, further roughing up that really nice dress that she wore. This was no setting for a lady, and it was a foe like none they had ever faced. Meanwhile, the genius mage was surrounded by her little magical barrier, and she stared up in surprise at the beast. However, the principal thanked the girl for buying him time. Would this be the end of the great beast that had already caused so much damage? The principal activated the highest ranked defensive magic, the shield of the god of creation. The powerful golden magic shone through and burst through the icy magic of the dragon's blue. As the principal fought the massive creature, the saintess was in the middle of a mental breakdown. It was her first time on a truly gory and bloody battlefield, and she was not taking the experience very well. The poor panicked girl stared in horror, her once perfectly white dress now stained with blood. She mumbled to herself, panting as she recalled that she had to hurry to the Mexus bridge and escape the island. There were corpses everywhere she looked, and nothing was free of death, nothing was safe. The girl tried to gather the strength to run away. Her hands were covered with blood, and her eyes flooded with tears as she trembled from the intensity of the situation she had found herself in. Her perfect and beautiful school life was not supposed to be this way. Clarice had heard so much about the beauty of life that she had completely overlooked the other side of life that was not as beautiful or sweet. It was terrifying, and the girl did not know what to do next. Suddenly, someone spoke to her, noting that she was safe. The girl looked up in surprise to see the senior ed. The boy was also covered in blood, and his arm was painted in lines of magic that showed that he'd pushed himself a little too hard. However, the blonde was just relieved to find that the saintess was safe. He then asked if she was hurt, stretching out his battered hand to help her. The girl was stunned, asking how he had known that she was here. The boy then reminded her that she had planned on meeting important guests, so he had a feeling that she would be at the Trix Hall. The saintess shakily tried to explain that she was riding a horse to the Mexus bridge. However, going over there was pointless. That area was too crowded, and even if she were to leave the island, she would not be able to escape the dragon's range, so she would have ended up dying in vain. Getting on Merylda, the boy then asked the saintess to hold on tightly as he pulled her up on the back of the forest spirit. Human strength alone would not be able to prevail against this beast. The principal and the strongest mage were not jointly fighting against the monster, but even with Lucy and Obel were here, all they could do was hold it back. According to the original story, Taylor would raise his power to the max and acquire the ultimate swordsman form. So, Ed wondered now if he should give up at this point. However, he clenched his teeth and shouted for Merylda to go forward. He had to get it together. The main story had fallen apart. Right now, the blonde had to find the biggest variation that caused the plot to deviate. He had to leave the fighters behind and charge forward. He was sure that would lead to a method to lure the sacred lance dragon back to slumber. At first, the boy had thought that this new variation was also somehow his fault. That was because up until now, if things had not gone according to the original plot, it was because he had something to do with it. However, even if the flap of a butterfly's wings could cause a tornado, the world ending was a bit too much. The finale of Act 5 should not be happening in Act 3, no matter what the fallen noble did. First, he needed to confirm who it was that summoned the sacred lance dragon. He had to acquire information about the major characters of Act 3 in order of importance. Adele, the Saintess Clarice, the hero Taylor, and the avenging Lucy. Lucy was currently fighting against the sacred lance dragon. Clarice did not seem to know anything, and she was really going through it right now. Meanwhile, Taylor, the protagonist, was an exception. The boy was likely running himself ragged trying to save people right now. That meant that the only other person besides him who could be changing the plot would be Adele, the traveling musician. That is when Ed made a connection that made his eyes widen. There was a lot of destruction in Nail Hall, and many students cried to each other, telling each other to run away. However, one pair of feet surged forward, seemingly unbothered by the chaos. Adele had come to the Nail Hall training room at 1 in the afternoon. She was to wait until her opponent for the next match was decided. The girl had received that note from her challenger, Clarice. However, the combat training had been cancelled due to a sudden change in the Saintess' plans. The musician thought it was a shame that they could not meet. However, the musician smiled that fate would have them meet one day. Darkly, she added that it had always been that way. The game's final boss, Wellbrock, suddenly awoke in the middle of Act 3. Fighting against that ferocious beast was impossible, and instead, there was a possibility of sealing him away if Ed could somehow find the reason for his awakening. Taking a look at the prominent characters of Act 3, it could not be Lucy or Taylor causing the shift in narration. It also was not Clarice. The only real difference in the story could be caused by Adele, the traveling musician of love, who was supposed to die in the current arc. Her attitude had been rather calm, even though she knew of her upcoming death. If our blonde MC was able to find her, he was sure that the truth would then be revealed. For now, he needed to take the poor traumatized Saintess to a safe place and to hurry and find Adele. However, the boy did not have much time, and he hurried away quickly on the mighty Wind Wolf. They had finally arrived at a safe place, and that is where he quickly deposited the Saintess, as the magical barrier protecting the Offles hall was still active. It was best for the young Saintess to stay there and to wait a while. Suddenly, the blonde realized that the barrier was indeed active, but the first attack stage was a bombardment of Wellbrock's scales and the barrier had failed to block that. This created a terrible situation where everyone inside the Offles hall was in danger, but fortunately, not everyone would have died from a fatal hit. The magical barrier was indeed still active, and the two hurried through the halls. There had to be someone maintaining the barrier spell inside the maintenance room on the top floor. They hurried to find the survivor on the top floor, and the young student was horrified to find the pierced form of Miss Bell, the head maid and manager of Offles Hall. The Saintess wanted to hurry to use holy magic and save the injured maiden. However, the situation was hopeless. The maid had already fallen victim to the first attack, and she had crawled to the top floor in that state, just in case there were other survivors. The maid did her duty to the students in the hall, sacrificing her life as she coughed up blood and pushed a golden key to Ed's burnt hand. In this moment, the injured maid would likely say something about simply doing what she had to do. A small tear slid down the maiden's eyes, and the Saintess sobbed in pain and horror, wondering how such a thing could happen. The ever-diligent and trustworthy Belle closed her eyes, and the main character's eyes darkened. Clarice was in denial. She could not accept that the head maid would not be all right, and the boy gritted his teeth, grabbing the girl and pulling her along. Belle was the first time that Ed had failed to save someone. They had to do what they had to do. First, since there was high-level magic active in her room, as long as it was not directly attacked, it should be safe. The Saintess had to keep a strong heart, and he would go out to figure out how to solve the situation. Clarice panicked, saying that it was too dangerous outside. However, he yelled at the sheltered girl to look out of the window. If they left things like this, then things would only get worse for everyone else. The boy's eyes then widened as he did indeed look outside the window, and he saw before him a marvelous sight. Aspectual magic was being used, formed in a beautiful bright blue. It was no normal aspectual magic circle either. The boy immediately raced to the shelves and started tossing books, surprising the Saintess, who was still trying to keep up with everything happening around her. The boy was sure that what he searched for would be in this room, and he read through all the titles of the books as he tossed them aside. Finally, he found Glock's Introduction to Aspectual Magic. The Sacred Lance Dragon was suddenly resurrected, Adele disappeared, and Clarice knew nothing. The situation required a lot of deep and critical thinking. Finally, the aspectual magic circle had materialized in the skies above. This was neither Obel nor Lucy's method, and it was a method of application that the boy had never seen before. The great dragon prepared to shoot yet another massive fireball from its giant throat. The fire descended, fortunately blocked by the barrier that the principal and the powerful mage prodigy were maintaining. The principal struggled against the great beast, knowing that he would be unable to block it all, and he panicked to see the fireball shooting off in the wrong direction. Finally, Ed understood the situation. It had all been twisted from the beginning. This was not part of the original story. The Saintess asked her senior if he had figured something out, when suddenly Offles Hall was bathed in a bright blue light. The fireball was coming down, and they saw it sparkling and glowing bright outside the window. What a beautiful sight to witness as the end drew near. Clarice cried as the light approached, her hands raised to protect herself. The light was blinding, washing over the two shocked students, heat coming down on them in waves and burning pulses, and the destruction that it caused was legendary. The Offles Hall that had barely managed to survive was consumed in heavy silvery blue flames, and the sound of the explosion making contact with the building was both beautiful and deafening. Offles Hall came down to rubble and ashes, and among the fallen bricks and stones, the Saintess Clarice managed to crack open her eyes. The girl's eyes widened when she saw droplets of blood fall over her face. She should not be alive, not after an explosion of that magnitude. The answer to her survival was Ed, who stood above her, his body wrecked in red bruises as he coughed out blood on the trembling Saintess. Tired and exhausted, the boy breathed out that no matter what happened, if the Saintess did not feel like she could handle something, she had to ask for help right away. She did not need to handle everything on her own. That was rich coming from a dude who just took a dragon-sized grenade for her on his own. The girl stared in horror at her senior, tears sliding down her cheeks, begging him not to give up. The boy mumbled out the numbers of 1, 6, and 0. Clarice did not care. She did not want to listen. Shakily, she tried to heal his wounds and save his life, begging him to stay alive. However, the boy was losing too much blood. There was no way for this to work. He fell forward into the arms of the crying girl, his body weak and his strength drained. The girl cried out for him, but the blonde's eyes had already gone dark. However, the blue spectral magic that floated in the center above the school began to twitch and move like a tide. The magical field around it expanded and grew to a great dynamic height, and the saintess cried as she held the boy in her arms. She did not understand why so many people had lost their lives just to protect her. Even her precious senior had sacrificed to keep her safe. She begged him not to die, holding his body in his arms and praying for him to survive. The girl cried and apologized, wishing that she had been more, that she could have done something significant to help. There was a moment of dark depression, when suddenly the saintess' eyes snapped open. The girl sat there with her eyes red from tears, and she stared in wonder and shock. She was seated once more at the tea party with Ed, with her guards keeping the people from getting close to her. It was mere minutes before the disaster struck the school. The students mumbled just like they had done in the past, asking why the saintess had come. Clarice was speechless, wondering what was going on. Janica was busy blushing about the saintess, just like before, and Ed was also clueless, asking what the saintess had come to speak about. The girl suddenly leapt across the table in a very not saint-like manner, and she grabbed the boy by the shirt in shock, staring at him as she fought back tears. She even tore open his shirt. The girl was not here to play. The boy was horrified, though. Sure enough, as she stared at his naked abs, she saw that his body was not harmed and he did not have any of the injuries that she had expected to find. The students were shocked. The guards were shocked. Janica was shocked. Everyone was shocked. And Clarice was busy being shocked for a completely different reason. The spirit sorcerer immediately protested the saintess' rough handling of her crush right in front of her, especially in broad daylight. However, the beautiful girl with long silver hair suddenly leapt back with an unreadable expression on her face. The girl took shaky deep breaths, and she wondered if everything that had happened had just been a dream, a terrible nightmare or a premonition. It had felt so real, and tears gathered in her eyes as she recalled holding her senior's dead body and watching the light die from his eyes. She had seen Belle die, and she had experienced that fear like it had been real. She could even see the marks of Ed's bloody hands on her skin. Tears gathered and Clarice shook as she realized that she had come back to the past. Now this is the kind of action that I've been looking forward to. Time seems to be running on a motorbike ever since 2020, but it just can't go fast enough for more chapters to come out sooner. Even though this manhwa updates weekly, the anticipation for it is always so high that it's really tough to count down the days until the next release. In any case, we have no choice but to wait for more chapters to come out, so check out some of my other series in the meantime. Also, if you're new to the channel, definitely be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future uploads. Until next time.